College football nerds talking A&M, talking LSU, probably looking at a model that predicts a score as if it was a 7 overtime A&M LSU game. We're going to talk about it. Josh is with me as usual. We're going to get nerdy. We're going to talk numbers. We're going to go through our computer model. First, I want to remind y'all, as we always do, give us your score prediction in the comments. LSU fans, or if you are still hanging around at 3-3 at this point in the season, coming off the Arkansas win, let us know if you think you're going to bounce back again and get an A&M win this Saturday. Josh, we were talking about some numbers before we rolled this, and I know LSU fans were a little frustrated with our Alabama LSU preview for a game that never got to get played because our model was like dunking on LSU's defense, and we spent some time dunking on LSU's defense just by laying out the facts. Because we don't really like trash talk on this channel. We're pretty neutral. But when the numbers are crazy, they're crazy, and we got to talk about it. So I think all of this lead-in is important because of how kind of staggering this number is. LSU fans, again, if there are children in the room, cover their eyes and ears. This is about to get kind of gnarly. Josh, set this up, both give some perspective on how bad LSU's pass defense has been this year, both where they rank and why their ranking is where it is, why that's so shocking based on who they've played. Let's get it.
LSU goes into this game having allowed 10 yards per attempt of 5 of their last 6 games. The only game where they did not was Vanderbilt. They allowed 4.5 yards per attempt. The others, they allowed 10.4 yards per attempt or more. Now, that number is enough to be last in the conference in yards per attempt allowed. They're allowing 10.4 yards per attempt on the season. But there's 2 reasons why that's even worse than you realize at first blush. The first is LSU has only played one team in the top half of the conference in yards per attempt. That team is Arkansas, who's 4th in the conference. And it's easy to say Arkansas was a fluke, but Arkansas is the only team that has a legitimate passing offense they faced. And even Arkansas statistics are inflated because they had 13 yards per attempt against LSU. The second thing is to understand that, one, these numbers come facing bad offenses, but 2, even still, the numbers aren't just worse than everyone else in the conference. They're worse by a margin. LSU is 14th in the conference. Texas A&M is 7th in passing defense yards per attempt allowed. A&M, who's faced Alabama and Florida, allows 7.7 yards per attempt. The 13th ranked team in the conference is South Carolina. That is 1.3 yards per attempt worse, and they allow 9 yards per attempt. LSU is 1.4 yards per attempt worse than South Carolina at 10.4 yards per attempt. The gap between Texas A&M and South Carolina is smaller than the gap between South Carolina and LSU. That's just utterly phenomenal. That LSU playing teams almost, 5 of 6 opponents all being in the bottom half of the conference in passing is the worst pass defense in the conference and is worse by a larger margin than A&M is over the next worst team. So really, when you think about it, playing A&M, playing should be rescheduled game against Florida, and possibly playing a rescheduled game against Alabama, these numbers are going to get significantly worse. That would be the inclination based off what we've seen. And quite frankly, this probably will end up being the worst pass defense in LSU history.
And a lot of times on this show, we try to find the story beneath the story in the stats, because people will twist stats however they want to do it. The analogy we gave, or the example we gave in the Auburn preview, was that at some point during early in the year, people were saying Alabama is 100 and whatever in opponent third down conversion rate. But they didn't look at the fact that Alabama had played A&M, had played Missouri, had played Ole Miss at that point. So sometimes things can be skewed. And I think it's worth noting LSU's only faced SEC teams. So if you look at nationally, it's maybe not so fair because they don't have those G5 and FCS games to kind of bolster their numbers. But we're just talking SEC, and there's some bad teams in the SEC, and they're still worse than them. That's the concern when you're coming in playing an A&M team that's not just got a good passing offense, they're actually balanced. And that's the other thing that we can't say about LSU is that they face anybody with balance. One thing that might be in LSU's favor, and I want you to talk about this for a minute too. We've seen a lot of these teams from Notre Dame with the 12-7 win over Louisville, with Alabama starting out against Kentucky this Saturday. We've seen this over and over where teams that have had these postponements have had, off weeks this season with COVID and everything and all the protocol stuff they're dealing with. They've had rust. So is this an opportunity maybe for LSU to at least stay in this game early and force some mistakes because you expect maybe Texas A&M to be a little bit rusty?
I definitely think there's a possibility of that. When you look at Mond's statistics this year, like every year with him, it's maddeningly inconsistent. 6.8 yards per attempt against Vanderbilt, 6 yards per attempt against Mississippi State, 7.1 yards per attempt against Alabama, which was just sort of passable. And then he lights up Arkansas, South Carolina, and Florida for over 9 yards per attempt in each one of those games. So his average is 8.2 yards per attempt. But how he got there is pretty head-scratching, right? I mean, Vanderbilt is not a better defense than Arkansas. They're just not. And it's really not even close. So how do you figure out why they are? And the truth of the matter is, as long as Kellen Mond has been at Texas A&M, they've been an inconsistent offense, and it's really dependent on what version of Kellen Mond you get on a given Saturday. We've talked about a lot that there's good Mond and bad Mond. We've talked a lot on this show that, we can give you numbers and insight and try to tell you what the average team is, but for all the prognostication people want to make, trying to figure out if a player is going to show up or not when he's inconsistent is a true guess. It really is. And everybody's going to say they have some different version of motivation or emotion or something else that matters. Sometimes I think home and away matters. Mond was definitely a lot better at home than away. But more often than not, people are guessing. And if you guess one of 6 different ways to do it, eventually there's going to be some pattern at random chance. And the person that guessed that pattern is going to think he's the smartest person on planet Earth. That's something that always irks us, by the way. That's the problem with A&M. And I think given, this situation and given the situation that, they're giving into with COVID, I think there's a chance that you end up with rusty Texas A&M where, Texas A&M doesn't show up and they don't play well and you end up with a Vanderbilt version of the team. But I will say this, the same thing with the Iron Bowl. And we never made this point in the Iron Bowl video, so I'm going to make it here, and I'll feel like I made it somewhere. My biggest concern with Auburn in that game isn't really even the passing game from Alabama. It is balance, and it is the fact that Auburn is undersized defensively, and they got pushed around in the Georgia game by a team that could kind of throw it. I don't know how their smaller front seven is going to handle Alabama's run game and not get blown over the top. That's the problem for LSU. I think Mond could come out cold and Mond could come out rusty. LSU hasn't been good run or pass this year, but they haven't played anybody quite good enough to dominate a game running it, maybe outside Auburn. And if they end up in the Auburn situation, A&M's offensive line is much better than Auburn's, and the run game is generally better than Auburn's. So if A&M can run the ball really successfully, then it's not even going to really matter if Mond isn't hot. Mond being hot or not is going to be the difference between A&M scoring 40 and A&M being able to score 60.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I think it's fair that we touch on is that in all of this showing how bad LSU has been defensively this year, which we're talking about it because it's kind of unprecedented. We're talking about it because we expect more out of LSU, even with opt-outs and injuries and all that they lost in the NFL. It's not to, like I said, dunk on LSU. It's just kind of it's the context that's required in these game discussions. But one thing that we had a tendency to miss a little bit in our Alabama preview, and I want to make sure we don't miss it here, is A&M's a good football team. Like, we've had them in our top 10 all year. You've had them grossly overranked at like number 3. and just royally pissed off every Notre Dame fan on earth. Maybe they're not overranked, but and that's why you A&M fans keep coming back to our top 25 videos, and we love it. No matter how you cut it, though, A&M is a good team. It's surprising to me, given that they were breaking in new receivers this year, really lost some key players on defense last year. But I think a lot of it does go through that offensive line, and they've actually played better defensively than I expected. And I'm going to go on a little rant here because Florida fans keep hammering this recency bias, which they didn't look great against Vanderbilt Saturday, so maybe that's something. But they keep hammering this recency bias, and their takeaway from the A&M game was that, hey, we should have won that game, and if we played A&M today, we'd kill them. What they don't realize is, like, A&M, like, the late fumble was forced. Like, the fumble that A&M got was forced. The fumble that A&M gave up was not forced. If you look at the stat sheet, A&M actually kind of dominated that game in yards, yard per play, time of possession, everything. So I imagine if you looked at the win probability of that game, it probably was A&M. So I think there's this notion that A&M is kind of skating by on the fact that they haven't played anybody. It's like last year they didn't get respect because they couldn't beat the number one team, number 2, 3, 4 in the country, so they couldn't even get ranked. And now people don't want to rank them high because they lost to Alabama, but they beat Florida. And it's like there's this weird reverse pedigree with their name that's frustrating. A&M's going to win this game Saturday. Yes, LSU is struggling, but A&M is also a very good team, and they're going to win on their own merits. So why don't you get into the numbers of this? I've seen it already. It's kind of ridiculous. I don't entirely agree with it, but get into the numbers on this, and then we'll give some picks.
Yeah, and I do want to agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, I've ended up being an A&M defender for a few years, and it's kind of almost a running joke. But the reason is they've had brutally hard schedules. I haven't thought they've been an elite team, but the past couple of years, I thought they were good enough to be top 25. I mean, my point has been App State beats South Carolina by a point. A&M runs South Carolina out of the building. The only difference is that App State wasn't playing, number 1 4 times in the same season, so they had a better win-loss record. A&M would have absolutely beaten App State. And I'll also say, on the record right now with Notre Dame, I think A&M. I would pick A&M to beat Notre Dame, and I don't know if I would pick A&M to beat Clemson or not, given what I knew about Clemson and their injury situation. But I don't think they would have played any worse than Notre Dame did in that game, and that's why I've had them where they had. I mean, it's just a totally different schedule and situation. So with that in mind, kind of getting into the model, the stats of these two teams could not be any different. A&M averaging 5.4 yards per carry, really the dominant run game, I think, in the SEC. 8.2 yards per attempt is good. It's not necessarily elite. Like we talked about at length, that's a weird number that's in a combination of some dominant games and some shockingly mediocre ones. LSU has been more consistent, and they've been consistently solid, but maybe not as great as people think. 3.4 yards per carry, 8.1 yards per attempt. They've been pretty good moving the ball. They were certainly a lot better early in the season. I think like you said, there's some recency bias maybe in the other direction where, they threw the ball well against Mississippi State. Mississippi State has some issues in the secondary that have popped up off and on throughout the year. They dominated a Vanderbilt defense that's just straight bad. They dominated a Missouri pass defense that is not very good. They blew out a South Carolina defense that was quitting and has been really spotty off and on all year. And then they play Auburn and Arkansas, and they look really pedestrian. I don't know entirely that it's about Finley, okay? But, it's no doubt that their offense right now has been average pass, not great run. The problem is defense. I mean, A&M's run defense is good at 88%. It's not necessarily elite. They're good in pass defense at 93%. Not necessarily elite. Now, this is relative. Normally, it's relative more nationally because it's including your out-of-conference numbers. Right now, it's an isolated data set, so this is purely SEC relative. So better than average, maybe standard deviation better than average SEC defense for the season. LSU's 123% of rush averages, 148% of opponent passing averages. Whatever you normally get passing, LSU's going to give up 50% more. And whatever you normally give up rushing, they're going to give up 25% more. And the model just like pulls its hair out when it sees that. It's thinking you're going to give up 6.6 yards per carry, 12 yards per attempt. So even though LSU gets a respectable 5.4 yards per play, a little better, probably better output than you'd expect from Auburn against Alabama, 26 points. A&M at 9.5 yards per play, that's 2 yards per play better than A&M has gotten at any point this year. The model just sort of throws its head back and goes, I don't know, 77? 77-26? That's what it's guessing. That doesn't even look like a football score. It's hard to score 77, but it's kind of assuming that A&M plays a 4-quarter game, and it's basically saying, look, if A&M plays 13 possessions in a game, they're going to score 11 touchdowns on the 13 possessions. It realistically thinks that's what this game is going to look like. I don't think you score 77 because there's no way you keep the pedal down that long, but good grief. I mean, I don't think, we said last week with Alabama that it was high. It's actually higher with A&M just because it thinks A&M is more likely to run the score up. That's what this really means. We've never had a model give 77 points. It's the most ever, and it's a reflection of how just tissue paper LSU's defense is statistically.
And like logic would say, well, we just gave up only 24 points to Arkansas, so maybe your model should have adjusted a little bit after the Alabama one and seen LSU's defense in a little better light. The problem is how the model works relative to allowed yardage per play and production and how that translates to points, because when you're giving up 13 yards per attempt to freaking Felipe Franks, then it's going to say Kellen Mond is going to give you, a bad day. So I think the model's a little off. The model can't look into the fact that I feel like A&M is going to come out rusty. We've seen this with every team. We saw with Alabama Saturday. Yes, they won 63-3 or whatever, but that was because Kentucky gave up in the second half. Alabama was really off to start that game. Notre Dame against Florida State and Louisville, it took them like 3 weeks to recover. Really off. So I do think that A&M wins this game comfortably, but I think some of the rust kicks in. Give me 39-20. And that 39 is a weird number, but I'm sticking with it. It's a weird day. 39-20 A&M over LSU. What you got?
You know what? I'm going to go all in, and I'm going to drink the Kool-Aid a little bit. The point I'd make with Arkansas is, Felipe Franks was 13 yards per attempt. It was typical Arkansas. It was inconsistent, but what it showed was they could give up explosive plays to an offense. The problem in comparing them is that A&M is first in the conference in rushing offense by a margin. Okay, 5.4 yards per carry. Alabama is second at 4.8. Again, talking differences, it's like the difference between Alabama and Georgia-ish, Florida, Georgia, about average in the conference. That's how far A&M is ahead of everybody. Arkansas was one of the worst rush defenses in the conference at 3.8 yards per carry. So I think the balance from A&M just makes this impossible. LSU hasn't played anyone with anything resembling this amount of balance, and they've gotten, just torched defensively throughout the year. I think this could be an offensive bloodbath. I'm gonna pick 56-24. I'm calling my shot. I may be dead wrong. We'll see. A&M could come out rusty, but I really think the takeaway coming out of this game, and I think it could be the takeaway through the rest of the year, is we all kind of knew how bad LSU was because they were losing bad games. I think people are going to really realize how bad LSU is when they actually start playing good teams, and they're not just losing, but they're losing by really large margins. Because I'm going to say it bluntly, statistically, this team is no better than most of your bottom level teams in the conference. And I don't think LSU fans are used to being treated that way. And we saw it in the Auburn game, which means it can absolutely happen. A&M is a better team than Auburn. They are more balanced than Auburn, and I think the game could be even uglier.
And I think I felt a little better about LSU offensively this week. I think that Auburn game, they kind of just ran into a little bit of a trap where The first week you bring in somebody off the bench playing for a Myles Brennan who he's a freshman and there's no tape on him, it can be a little bit of a challenge to defend a guy like that. The next week, Auburn's got the benefit of tape, kind of shuts him down, and then we see, a follow-up after they've had a chance to adjust, that they were actually, 27 points against an Arkansas defense that we're pretty high on. I don't hate that from LSU, and that's why I've got them with 20 points here, which I think A&M's defense is not bad. I think that if look, we did see this against Auburn, and this is why I don't think they score many more than 20 points. If A&M is scoring frequently and LSU has to get into a passing situation, they're going to get buried. And this is the same thing we're worried about with Auburn when they play Alabama, is they're going to get buried if they have to throw the ball. And so I don't think they're going to score much more than 20. I just don't think that A&M is going to be firing on all cylinders in the first half, and they're going to shut it down in the second half, which is going to be hard to hit the number that you're giving. Okay, so let's talk one more thing before we close this out. If A&M doesn't blow out LSU, let's say they win, 27-20. Are you dropping them in your rankings? Or are you going to attribute a lot of that to rust and want to see them another game or two before you start really worrying about A&M?
It's always circumstantial, but I probably will drop them. I mean, my expectation is that they dominate this game because of how well they have been playing. I think they've got issues at corner. Opt-outs really hurt them. They've played better as the season went along, but they're not great. I will say, though, that I haven't thought like Notre Dame's corners played well, and they really got torched against Clemson, and they've gotten didn't impress me there either. I think there's an avenue for A&M to keep this game close where, LSU, if they play well, can, has the talent to stay with somebody. And LSU with, like, Elias Ricks with a lot of turnovers, they've got guys that, can generate sacks and negative plays on a team. And so all that stuff does give some ability for LSU to sort of stay in a game. But, outside like, Ojolari and Ricks making negative plays, if it's on A&M's head where they're not playing well, where the corners are getting beat, yeah, I'm going to drop them. Because they're, I think, like you said, third, which I can't even believe hearing in my own head. They're that high in the ranking. And that's a tough spot to hold on to, and you've got to be playing really, really good football. My expectation is that they're balanced enough to stay there, and that's what they'll be. And I'll make one final point, and I'm curious your thought on this. I would think this game would be a lot closer on both sides of the ball if Brennan was actually there. If LSU could throw the ball well enough to keep it close and to keep their defense interested, and to keep the game having some semblance of balance, I do think it would be a lot closer. Now, I'd probably still pick A&M, and I'd say it'd be like 31-44, that kind of a thing. But the lack of Brennan means I think this game could get away from LSU really fast, and I don't think they're anywhere near consistent enough to exploit what A&M's deficiencies may be, which is really, really awesome run defense, solid front seven play, some shaky secondary play at times that can get bombed on. I mean, do you agree with that? Do you think this game, given the defensive issues, how much do you think Brennan actually matters here?
I don't think he matters in terms of win-loss. I do think he matters in margin because, we saw Brennan carry them a good bit this year. So it's a double whammy for LSU where they lost all this defensive talent to the NFL, had opt-outs and everything. Defense was going to be trash regardless. But then had decent quarterback play. I mean, look at the Missouri game. I think it was 45-41. Like, he did all he could to keep them in that game and get them a win. So I honestly think that with Brennan in the game, they do get into the 30s, and they do have a puncher's chance, at least to make it respectable, because then that changes your philosophy offensively and defensively. I think LSU is going to completely Kentucky strategy versus Alabama here and just – try to slow play the game, try to get into the fourth quarter, and hope A&M makes enough mistakes that melting the clock, running the ball, snapping it with 2-3 seconds on the play clock gets them into the fourth quarter with a chance by just obviously shorten the game. So we run late on this one a little bit, but we did have some stuff to talk about, and it was an interesting model that I wanted to discuss. So I'm glad we got a chance to do that. Remember, in the comments, let us know what you think the score is going to be, but also let us know if you think the model's that crazy, if you see why the model is predicting that, because it's so unprecedented for an LSU team to be showing numbers like this. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.